Kiran ma'am, over to you.
Yeah. Now we invite Professor Charanjit Singh.
Yeah,
Uh,
please.
yeah, sir, please, you're most welcome. Please come and share your experience on the virtual floor.
Introduce Professor Charanjit.
Kiran
Yeah,
ma'am,
yeah, yeah.
maybe
No.
if you let,
Yeah. I
could
like first.
introduce.
Okay. Yeah. Professor Charanjit has taught in Center of Russian Studies, School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies for more than 30 years, from 1986 to 2019. He's an expert of linguistics, syntax, semantics, lexicology, theory, and practice of interpretation and translation. He did his PhD from Moscow State University, Moscow, Russia. Professor Charanjit Singh has a great contribution to the interpretation profession. He has done interpretation with the high-level delegates, heads of governments in different bilateral summits held in India and abroad. In G20 Brisbane Summit, the capital of Queensland, Australia, held in 2014. In the 8th Annual BRICS Summit and International Relations Conference held in 2016 in Goa, India. In Vibrant Gujarat Summits, India. St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Russia. Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. He has also accompanied our Prime Minister and other high-level government delegates for interpretation in many bilateral summits held in almost all Russian-speaking countries: Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and other CIS countries. He was one of the interpreters with Professor R. Kumar, as you already know, with our Prime Minister during his visit to Russia in 2006. Professor Charanjit is one of the best teachers of Russian language and taught almost all courses which are taught in Center of Russian Studies at BA, MA, and MPhil level. Now I request Professor Charanjit to share his experience with us. Privetskую vas, Professor Charanjit Singh.
Thank you. I hope I am audible enough.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Am I visible?
Yes, sir. You are visible, sir.
Okay. All right. See, a few of the things which our colleagues have discussed with Professor Kumar. Just one issue regarding interpreting Modi. Most of the things have been.
Sir, sorry to interrupt you. Can you please move the camera a bit lower sides? Because your face is not coming completely.
You mean like this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is
Right, sir.
now okay.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So, well, my experience tells me that interpreting is one of the easiest interpretation jobs that one ever has to do. One thing, as Bhargav also pointed out, the texts are shared in advance and in every case, except when there is a discussion where there is no text, there also, in fact, when we went for the Moscow summit with Professor Kumar, all the even confidential talking points and issues which were not even discussed, were likely to be discussed, were shared with us at my request by them. We requested the officials to give everything. So they gave us everything, even those things which were not discussed finally. And as regards whatever Sanskrit, those issues were resolved in the discussion, so I will not go back to them. Those things are always explained in the text itself. To make a long issue short. Now, coming back to my original, originally prepared extempore speech. I was told by the organizers that one should start with how we got to doing this and what were the difficulties faced. Well, since there are two types of interpretation, I would first take simultaneous interpretation because that is what I mostly do, and then maybe come back to consecutive interpretation. Uh, so I got the chance. In fact, here also I would like to add to what Professor Kumar said. I think he may have started interpretation in the 70s, whereas I got this chance when there was a huge, festival of Russia in India, and there were 4 parallel sessions going on in 1988. That is when I was given the chance first time, and when I was in the economic and trade section. And as soon as I started, my colleague who was sitting next to me and even several other colleagues who were listening to me, they all thought that I was doing a really good job of it. Uh, and as they said, I had a natural flair for it. And of course, I know that uh, I was able to convey the entire meaning the first time of all the deliberations, but I knew that my uh, my speech did need more polishing because as a first time job one is a little bit anxious and in a hurry and you know so that of course comes with practice, and that is not something that I was worried about. In fact, because it was a large conference, many of our students were working in the hall for assisting the delegates, of which there were, hundreds at that time because it was a large conference. Since some of the senior ones were interested, I asked them to sit in the next booth and listen to the interpretation. Then they also went and listened to the opposite booth interpretation. And then they told me that I should teach them interpretation. So this is how I started, and the start itself was very encouraging for me, which also gave me the opportunity to keep on working. So does not mean that, of course, I learned, gradually how to polish that. But you see, since uh, in that uh, session and the subsequent sessions which I did over the 3-4 days that the conference was on, it was all live discussion. Nobody was reading prepared speeches. The real issue in interpretation comes with prepared speeches, which are actually the bane of interpretation. But I will come to that later. Having heard interpretation before, I got exposure to some of the things of what to do and what not to do. One of the things that I learned what not to do is that in the previous year, in 1987, there was a major World Writers Conference also held in Vigyan Bhavan, where writers had congregated from the whole world. And the main Russian guest there was the famous poetess Bella Akhmadulina. And, you know, my senior colleagues were interpreting, and to add to what Kumar said, he started in the 70s, but I started maybe about 15 years later, uh, not as he said we were doing together. There were many senior people who were doing with him before me. So another colleague was going to interpret Bella Ahmadulina's speech. You know what happens in such conferences is that uh, everybody else is speaking in English and interpretation is being done into Russian. That is not considered as important a part of interpretation because you know Russians will give you concessions for what they are hearing, and sometimes interpreters are not as conscientious and as serious about doing them. The most important part is when you are doing from Russian into English, where all the people who do not know the language are dependent only on you. So Bella Ahmadulina had in fact handed over a handwritten text in advance, and I was sitting in the booth along with my colleague when the interpretation was being done and listening to the whole thing. What I saw was that our colleague was trying to show as if there is no written text and live interpretation is being done. As a result, I thought that uh, some of the parts of the interpretation sounded very contrived to me. So it was a lesson even before I did simultaneous interpretation that these are not the things that you have to try. You do not have to try to be someone you are not. And your uh, job is to convey the meaning as has been amply brought out by what was said earlier by Professor Kumar. So this brings me basically to the attitude and what one is looking for in the process of interpretation. I also hear now, while I am interpreting, I do hear other colleagues and what they do while interpreting, and in the process, I have a couple of, and of course, my experience of working with the students uh, while I was teaching interpretation. Uh, these are uh, the two basic things which I think, I mean, at an elementary level, not going to all the details of what all is required for interpretation, because a large number of uh, things are required, but I will focus on these two basic things which could really help. Not, I don't mean here experts like who are, who have been engaged, or Shipra, or many others. I don't know personally Vitral Zalki, but like he said, how long he has been working. And there are many others here who also have, I think, a very good amount of experience in interpretation. Nilima was one who was talking about it. So I'm not talking of them. Basically, if you are a beginner or even not exactly a beginner, but have some experience, then these are a couple of things that could be useful. So what is the most significant thing? That is the ability to hear and process speech in one language while you are talking in another. Yeah. So that requires a lot of practice, and there are, of course, lots of ways of learning to do that. Some of those things, of course, we were discussing with the students. So many of our students are also attending this, and they would remember those things. Uh, but anyway, this thing is acquired with a lot of practice. So what is the solution for a beginner or not exactly a beginner? That is, convey most by speaking as little as possible. Bhargav Mitra had also talked of it for consecutive interpretation, but I mean in simultaneous interpretation, what you focus on is not on words, but the essence behind them, and select the shortest route to expressing that meaning, that gist which you have derived out of the speech by the original speaker. I will give a couple of examples of what you may hear uh, interpreters doing, even experienced interpreters, and what one could do instead. Some examples, what I heard recently at the negotiations for SEO, which are ongoing before pending the November summit, which is going to be held in India, since India is chairing, so India is holding a lot of negotiations. Now, let me give some of the examples. Now, a simplest example, the Indian side or somebody says, it is an important principle for us. Now the interpreter says, это является важным принципом для нас. Now you would say, fine, the interpretation has been conveyed. Now my point is, you don't say является. Это важный принцип для нас. Now what that does is, you take away является and the endings in творительный падеж. What that does is that you have to think less about endings.
Sir, sorry to interrupt you. Can you just please
क्या हुआ?
mute my? Yeah,
अभी सुनाई देगा.
sorry, it was yeah.
बीच में क्यों म्यूट क्यों हो गया था?
Sorry, done.
Chalo, anyway, doesn't matter. You can hear me now.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you speak less, you have more time to hear. And in simultaneous interpretation,
Sir,
yeah.
one request, sir. Actually, there is low bandwidth at your side. Can we see you on you clear in a clear manner? If you just stop the video, if you just stop the video, then it's clearer.
Okay, yeah.
Can we do that?
Yeah.
Now you please carry on, sir.
That will help the sound, the audio. Right? That's what.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, sir.
So now I will take another example. All these are from current negotiations. Я прошу представителя Таджикистана проинформировать нас, согласны ли они с этой версией. Now, the interpretation that I heard was literal and the sentence was as long. What I would say instead, прошу Таджикистан среагировать. 3 words instead of the 12 or so words that have been used in the original. I'll take another example. Do you have any comments to add? Now, the interpreter added from one side, one's own side. Я хочу узнать, есть ли у вас комментарии или замечания? What would be more appropriate in my view, which works for interpreters? Ваши замечания, пожалуйста. Now, we do not have anything to add. That is the response. We accept it as it is. So instead of doing all the words, what do you say? Нет, принимай. And that's it. You don't need to add anything else. Yeah. So another example. Now, this was being done by a Russian. The question is, can you hear me? The Russian says, вы можете слышать меня? Well, an Indian saying it is still okay, but a Russian saying it, because the correct expression would be вы слышите меня, even if the whole thing was to be said. I would just say слышно. That is one word instead of the 4 words used by now. And the next one is, если вы не можете слышать меня, this is what the interpreter is saying, то мы просим вас написать нам по чату. So this is all going on in Zoom. So I would say, and in fact saying it, if the person cannot hear, does not make sense. So if one is to write, one should write, если не слышно, просим написать в чат. So, well, the long and short of what I said is that speaking less allows you to focus on listening more and processing more processing time. this also, which I had always been telling the students, that is, if you have a shorter word instead of a long word, select a short word, not a long word. Similarly, use abbreviations wherever it is possible, not full forms of known concepts, even if they are being used in the original. So for instance, in this micro, small and medium sized enterprises, you should say MMSP. So, so the Russian says, which уже подписан memorandum о взаимопониманиях. And the interpreter says, the memorandum of understanding has already been signed. I would never recommend doing that. The MOU has already been signed. So again, allowing for the time to focus on listening and processing. This is not to say that this is what you should always do. When feasible, you should do it always, but when not, when you have plenty of time, then you can give the full expressions. There is no bar on that from my side. My point is that you will be better served, at least in the initial and not so initial period, by minimizing your speech without compromising on the essence. So, uh, so why some of the interpreters are doing it? Well, so one reason is that it never occurred to them. That is one reason. The second reason is that they want to sound very proper. Now, you see, that is all very fine. You should sound very proper, but the versions which I have offered, they do not compromise on meaning. So my point would be that the two examples where an interpreter tried to show as if it is live interpretation and not from written text, and these examples, I would say that instead of focusing on projecting what you are not, focus on conveying the essential. Well, on what they will think, well, the original was so long and the interpretation so short. Don't worry, you are saving their time. Yeah, and if finally anyone asks, tell them that you have conveyed the essence and it will work for them. Yeah. So that was one of the points I wanted to make. Now, if we come back to the main issues in simultaneous interpretation, which I faced initially, that is, issues are always with prepared text. When the speaker has the text with himself and you don't have anything. Now, as Professor Kumar also and some other speakers also mentioned, people, in fact, nervous people who are reading out a prepared text and sometimes for lack of time go so fast because they are nervous, they want to finish it off. And they don't give you any time, enough time for interpretation, then of course losses in interpretation are unavoidable. So what I would say, there is a concept in interpretation, that is training the client. That is one of the jobs of the interpreters, is also to train the client in what are the necessary components of interpretation. That is, of course, it starts with the physical attributes, that is, what kind of a booth they should take, what kind of an apparatus, the best and the most accepted apparatuses in the world are Bosch systems for interpretation. They have a large variety of features which are very, very useful. So, and there are several Chinese versions which sometimes compromise on some of the features. So starting from the physical attributes of interpretation and requirements, uh, the more important part, as was already mentioned here, is that the written speeches, the background material has to be there. They have to provide. Far too often the interpreter and the agency are scared to ask the speaker or the organizer for fear of offending them. You know, so some are high government officials and the agency just wants the contract and they want to somehow, you know, wade through it without troubling. Yeah, but you see, so many foreign language speakers, Russians, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, to mention a few, keep their docs ready to hand over. And often no one asks them. I had this experience just last year when an agency told me we have been asking them for so many days. Those were the Koreans who were handing over the charge for, you know, the next chair to India, something on law. It was legal issues, and when they said they have not given, we have been asking. So I just because it was 3 hours before the start, the meeting was to start at 2 p.m. At around 11 o'clock, I just decided to ask the Koreans directly. They were all in the hall. So I walked up to the head of the Korean delegation, whom one could make out by the way others were, you know, referring to him. And the agency people tried to stop me. But I nevertheless went and asked. They immediately supplied all the materials for all the 3 days. Moreover, they put it in all the language booths. So then the agency guy asked me half in jest, क्या उन्हें भी आपने हमारी तरह डांटा क्या? So I explained to him then that these people are well aware of interpretation issues because they suffer if their speech is not interpreted, and that happens often with them because of the language barrier. So please don't hesitate, keep asking. So you have to tell the agency, you have to tell the organizer, and the interpreter himself must be bolder. And that will only help, not go against the interpreter, because finally you will be able to do a better job. Today, of course, the situation is much better compared to when Professor Kumar was doing, and for a long period in the previous century when I was also doing. Today, if you get the agenda, you insist on getting the agenda at least, then you know the topic, you know the organizers, then the internet will help you to fish out mostly all the previous deliberations on the issue which happened during the previous meeting, whenever that meeting was. And uh, so, uh, and believe me, the proceedings will not be much different from what you have fished out. And then once you have prepared, you can ask them for uh, the specific documents, talking points, whatever they have. Yeah, sometimes there are no prepared speeches. Uh, so uh, that itself would suffice for you to get the vocabulary from out of that and prepare. And you should always prepare a glossary for every separate event. Never compromise on that. Now, uh, so these are the couple of things that I wanted to say about simultaneous interpretation. Now, a little bit about A little bit about consecutive interpretation, if you are still interested. Yeah, shall I go on?
Sure, 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 please.
Yeah. So, uh, consecutive interpretation, as you are well aware, is a very different kettle of fish. Yeah. Whereas in simultaneous interpretation, you do not have to remember so much. And of course, what you really have to remember very well are figures. Uh, in consecutive interpretation, you have to remember everything. Therefore, the standard recommendation for consecutive interpretation is taking notes. So, luckily, of course, I have not used, I always scribble my own notation. Uh, but there are books on that. I also had a couple of books in Russian. I think they may still be lying in my office room, which is not my room for the last more than couple of years. But Dr. Ajay Karnatis, but he has been very kind to let me leave my books there pending, their disposal in different ways. Uh, some I had promised to some universities, included Jamia Millia people, and then of course this uh, lockdown happened and nobody is using the office, so we will do that. So some of those books might be lying in the office in English. In English, there is a good book about taking for consecutive interpretation. So I think friends could consult those. I would say that from amongst the things that I use, some are uh, that is use of arrows, an upward arrow indicating rise, increase, or growth, downward arrow increasing slip or a decline or a decrease, yeah, a backward arrow that is regress or come back, return, forward arrow, forward pointed arrow that is pointed to the right could mean hence or consequence or even future. I use it as future also. Depending on the context, you can make it mean anything in your notation. Uh, Arrow pointing in both directions can mean exchange or relations. Now, you see, this is one thing, and then some other notations. For economy, you use econ, then for energy, E, for policy, use the Greek pi, yeah, etc. And for being happy, etc., and being sad, and other emotions, you could use the smileys and their main components, that is laughing lips or sad lips pointing downwards, etc. So now when you have done that, and names of countries, for India, I just use a capital I, RF for Russian Federation, for Japan, one would use JAP, and then China, CH, etc. You can make your own notations. Now, there are ways of extending the meaning of these. So, India dash, and it becomes Indian or Chinese or any other national, that is citizen of the Russian Federation, RF dash. So, similarly, when you, the video went on. Similarly, when you underline these very things, then they start acquiring additional meaning. One underline would mean quite or somewhat. Let's say under the arrow, it will mean good rise. And if you put two, underline it twice, that means let's say, astronomic rise or growth. Similarly, with decline, return, etc., exchange or relations, uh, and let's say some of the things that you say are very happy, very sad. Also, under the smiley, you put that dash or two dashes, etc. Some of the other notations which are used is directions, north, south, east, west. Some Greek letters for different things, currencies. Then, of course, the all the chemical names in notation which are used in science, CO2, H2O, etc., CO, etc., and everything else. Now, words like assert or declare, now you use only say and you underline it, you are asserting. So poor, if you underline once, very poor. So, and if you underline it twice, it means extremely poor or proper poverty. Or if you underline it with a dash, then badly off, etc. So, I hope you get the gist of it. Uh, that you have to make your own notation using some of these basic things, or you could consult and use the guides which are there on notation in consecutive interpretation. Well, I had also prepared one large sentence in Russian and how I would do the notation, but I think you get the gist, and I would stop here, and I would be happy to answer any questions if I'm able to. Thank you for attention.
Thank you so much for this interesting speech.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk on the aspect of interpretation. Maybe we can have questions or discussions. Request the participants to maybe raise virtual hand.
Let me just sum up. Yeah, what I have said is that
Yeah.
use essence and brevity. Yeah, that is, be short and never. Of course, what is the essence? How do you get at the essence? I think I may have not talked about that portion. It is that every speech or every sentence or every expression has a similar kind of content, that is, who or what is or happened or transpired, and then the условия, в которых это происходит, that is, how, when, where, etc. So you could also make, some people recommend graded notation, that is, some in 3 columns, some in 2 columns. So you could grade them. Let us say условия, that is, обстоятельства, мы записываем в одном столбце, а суть, содержание, то есть события в одном, и так далее. So when you focus on who, what, that is the subject, then is, transpired, happened, etc., that is событие, то есть обычно выражаемое глаголом, and then of course условия. So you get to what is the most important thing being said. Sometimes the answer lies not in the main clauses, but only at the end in maybe a very secondary clause. But going by the context, you have to convey what is the most essential thing. Focus precisely on that. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. I have finished now. Sorry to interrupt.
Questions?
Yeah. Krishna, do we have questions on YouTube? Yeah, maybe Krishna was looking at the questions. There are.
We have a question from YouTube. Should I read?
Okay, okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Uh, she is Parijat Bhattacharya. Her question is, what should an interpreter do if there is no equivalent in the target language? Should that part be skipped or should it be replaced with a closer variant? Her second question uh, is about speaking shorter sentences. Does it sometimes give the wrong idea to the audience that maybe the interpreter is not translated everything that was said? That's it, sir.
Yeah. Now, you see, when I said short sentences, I mean simultaneous interpretation, not consecutive. Yeah, because in consecutive interpretation, you have the time and you can, in consecutive interpretation, also, you see, some people, I mean, the organizers in the context that I mentioned and gave the examples for, the organizers are looking for the keywords, and if you give it to them, mostly there will be no issue. But one has always to go by the given context and the situation. You cannot take any formula as magic formula for all situations. Yeah. When I said you use MOU or MMSP, that is only for situations when you are sure that your listeners, being experts on that issue, are well aware of these terms. So, in other situations, you may have to, on the other hand, expand and give explanations. For instance, if somebody starts talking of Hathras, that Hathras mein ye hua, wo hua. Now you have to add a town in UP here and there, so that means you always have to add or subtract based on the requirement of the situation. That is one thing. Now, the second question is about the absence of, and now in simultaneous interpretation, the audience is listening only to you, not to the speaker. They can't mostly hear the speaker in 9 cases out of 10. So they are not even aware that you have said something shorter or longer. So I think that takes care of that question about being short. And as I said in my speech earlier, do not worry about what you look like to the audience. Worry about conveying the meaning and the essence. And if you have done that part sufficiently well, I'm not talking of the situation that Bhargav was mentioning when somebody is speaking 15 sentences. If I were there, I would not allow them. I would stop them myself. But anyway, I'm not trying to say that Bhargav should have done it. No, it depends on the situation, whether you are in a position to do it or not. Well, I mostly think that I am. Now, with my seniority, even the people who have retired are, in the SEO negotiations, all the bosses are calling me sir. So obviously my status is slightly different today. So it may not be the same for everyone in different situations. Talking of equivalence, obviously there is no question of dropping that. You explain that concept using other terms. And this issue of equivalence is not a very simple issue. It crops up all the time, and you always have to find a descriptive equivalent or something which is already acceptable, that is already the dictionaries accept that as equivalent. You have to use that. I hope it answers your question. Yes, I am done.
Yes, sir. Do we have other questions? Yes, sir. Krishna, do we have other questions on YouTube?
No, sir. That's it from YouTube. There is no other question.
All right. Thank you very much, Krishna. Devasmita ji wanted to say something, sir.
Yeah. Hi.
Devasmita ji, please unmute your mic.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sonu. Professor Singh, warm greetings. Absolutely delightful listening to you. Thank you so much. Nuances in interpretation is crucial for us journalists, as that sets the tone and provides us an angle for our stories. My question to you is about interpretation of humor, irony, sarcasm, and punchlines. It is said that an interpreter's ultimate challenge is interpreting humor. Do you agree? Or is it pretty straightforward? Thank you.
No, of course it is not straightforward. No, certainly not. But I must say that whenever such things have come up, somehow being well versed with humor and sarcasm in Russian and in English, and uh, I have been more or less able to do justice to the humor part. Now it's difficult to uh, give examples. Some of them are even unquotable. So I would refrain. What comes to my mind is not for public consumption. So I will refrain from doing that. But yeah, it can be done. Although yes, sometimes you have to convey, because sometimes there is a pun in one language. It is there. In the other language, the word does not have two meanings, and you will be hard pressed to find a similar word. Sometimes you can find, you can replace the word and which has two meanings and then convey. But sometimes you just explain that this is what creating the humor. I think these are the more challenging parts when a pun is only in one language. Then you do an explanation, and that still conveys. Right? I hope I conveyed, Devo.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sir, Praneeth Tolia. Please unmute your mic. Praneeth Tolia. Meanwhile, sir, Praneeth switches on his mic. I have actually a question, if you allow me,
Oh, who's this?
regarding the technology part, sir.
Who's this speaker?
Sir, Sonu here.
Yeah, Sonu, since your image.
Yeah, sir, I have a question. Like generally, while you're doing like interpretation, you are given a booth and you have a lot of various apparatus over there. So does it like have you faced any difficulties like in the beginning? Like operating those apparatus, because you have to switch over the switches, various switches over there.
This is a common issue that sometimes you may forget to switch on uh, or forget to switch off, or forget to toggle the language. It happens with all interpreters. Therefore, there is a person who is monitoring this, whether the interpretation is coming in a particular language or not. So if it is not coming, they would quickly come and toggle the switch or switch on or switch off. I also have often faced slightly different problem. That is, if your colleague who is sitting with you in the booth is inexperienced or is not very tech savvy, then they tend to, fiddle with buttons, and that sometimes design what I. That's how it is. So obviously they do have problems. I mostly never felt it because you go and study the apparatus, and now I know it. It's like you are reported. I can do settings, I can do whatever is required if somebody else doesn't know how to. That's it. I hope that's enough.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I
Thank you,
will
sir.
be able to ask.
Yeah. So Praneeth
Hello,
is.
am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, Praneeth. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. So my question is, when we are interpreting and whenever we have a text that is the pre-decided text, as if in the conferences or in the political meetings, but how one should tackle with the speaker who will be speaking extempo? And sir, my second question is, you talked about the shorthand information tools in the form of making arrows up and down so as to restore the information. So, is there any book or something guide is available that is internationally accepted for all these shorthand informations, or we have to make such notes with our own experience?
Yeah. I
Thank you, sir.
I did tell you that in Russian I have a couple of which I've never used, but they may be lying in my room in JNU, so I do not have access to their titles. These days it's not easy, it's not at all difficult to find if you just enter the topic and enter a word books, or not even enter that, some books will pop up. So one uh, book in English, which is well accepted, I already mentioned the title. It is called Note Taking for Consecutive Interpretation. So if you enter that on the internet, you will, a short course. Uh, it's by Andrew Gillies, so you can enter Andrew Gillies or you can enter the title of the book and you will reach it. Yeah. So there, of course, the issue of note taking is discussed in great detail. Not that I told you I use my own, very mostly I use abbreviated words and some notations, as I mentioned to you, and manage with that. Never had any problem, so I never resorted to studying these things in detail. But yeah, uh, I've told you one book. For Russian, you can just go to the net and запись при последовательном переводе или запись последовательного перевода. If you enter something like that, I'm sure you are likely to get access to more than one title. There are at least 2, 3 that I have seen, and a couple I have in my own room. So you will be able to access them and use them. They of course follow a very, very detailed program. It takes some learning, right? But that's it. Thank you.
Dr. Sonu has shared
Yeah,
the
Professor Banerjee, you had some question.
No. I'm saying you have shared the link of that book. That is what I'm saying.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sonu is the, I would say, to use a non-standard phrase, tech savviest amongst us. So he does things on the go. So that's very nice. So everybody can access it now. Yeah.
Bhargav ji wanted to ask some question. Is he here?
Let me just find him. I think he was here. Yeah, he's here. Bhargavji, please unmute your mic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Charanjit Singh. I think the points that you have made are very, very valid. In fact, the best part about your speech is that you cited examples on a real-time basis, on real-life examples, which actually will help all of us to have a better appreciation of what happens behind the scene at
That was
times.
my hope that, even experienced ones, if they have not thought about these things, sometimes make this mistake. And I quoted from real life usage by interpreters who have years of experience, some of them. So I thought it could be useful.
My experience of now this technology has improved a lot these days, and the buttons have become lesser. So before a meeting is held these days, when you go into the booth, uh, the the feed that you are supposed to be speaking into, and suppose you have the Russian feed, you are interpreting what the Indian delegation is speaking, and your feed goes to the Russian side. Essentially, that happens. When we are speaking in a simultaneous interpretation, then we normally interpret for our own delegation, which is from English to Russian. So the feed goes to the Russian side. So the system on the microphone is already set to the Russian feed. So we don't. That is explained to people, and nobody tampers with that. We just check it before we go into interpretation that the feed is into Russian. So I mean, in the hall also you can check it out before the meeting. That's one. The technology has. So there's no. The only thing is that, as Professor Charanjit Singh very rightly said, that as you start speaking, you have to switch on the mic. As we are doing it here. That you don't forget. I mean, once you are speaking, otherwise you won't be audible. And second is that the interpretation, what we normally do is very structured interpretation. Either it is political, or it is technological, or it is something to do with medicine or pharma. But we are never prepared for jokes. That is something which is very, very surprising.
Or
You
what
know, it,
we did.
jokes, Shrutki.
Ah,
No, Shrutka is a huge challenge. Any Shrutka
so
is a challenge. The jokes in one country, they totally are different from the jokes of the country that they are coming to. Now the Indian jokes are different, the Russian jokes are different, or something. Even among the Russian, the Central Asian jokes are different. The Russian, Belarusian jokes are different. Now the interpreter is unable, at most of the time, he doesn't even understand what the joke is. Now that is the worst situation that one can face. You don't even understand what is being said. Now you are interpreting. Now, at the end of your interpretation, your audience is supposed to enjoy and laugh. Now, that is the biggest challenge. If you cannot make your audience laugh, and by understanding the joke, then you are a gone case. So probably they will understand that you have not understood. Both the sides will understand that you have not understood. But this is something which I would definitely like to have the views of Professor Charanjit Singh on this. How you cannot prepare yourself for very native language words. We are not used to the typical native language words. What does an interpreter do? There's a lot of youngsters sitting here. They'll be required to undertake a lot of work. But this will always come up in a bilateral meeting in a hotel or a restaurant or wherever. Suddenly somebody will crack a joke, and you're not prepared. How do you handle it?
right. You have something else to say. Did you want to add something to what you said, or shall I reply?
You will answer, I think. He's just muted his mic.
Not here. Anyway, all I can say is that I can, conceive of such a situation, of what you are saying, but it just shows lack of exposure. So you have to have more exposure. If you have worked with Central Asia, then you have to acquaint yourself with that terminology. As I already said, personally, I have never faced such an issue. I would say even one more thing, that 90% of the jokes, I'm not negating what you are saying, are actually the same in every language. Now, for instance, there is this joke. in Russian only I heard it, but I told once in Hindi. So let me recall this. There's some, Грузин. Грузин идет к другу, который является инспектором полиции и говорит, ну, слушай, мне нужны права, на вождение имеется в виду, помоги, ты же этим занимаешься. Он говорит, ты мой друг, разумеется, я сделаю для тебя. Но я же инспектор, я задам тебе один вопрос. Хотя бы, чтобы узнать твои способности вождения. Ну, говорит, пожалуйста. Говорит, вот смотри, ты едешь по узкой горной дороге. Справа ущелье, а слева горы. И только одна машина может проехать. А навстречу тебе идут двое женщины. Одна старая, другая молодая. Теперь мой вопрос. На кому давить будешь? Он говорит, ну, если выбора нет, старуху, конечно. Я повторю тебе свой вопрос и повторил то же самое. Там, слева ущелье, справа горы. На кому давить будешь? Неужели молодую? Послушай. Будешь давить на тормоза. So, на тормоза или на кому? Ну, конечно, это ошибочно сказано по-русски так не говорят, но, тем не менее, на хинди я перевел. बस ये हालत है तो किसमें दाबेगा तो and finally the answer is to break ne dabega nahi. So my point in telling this joke, although I may not have been able to make the audience laugh also, as you said, is that most of the jokes are common and universal in all the languages. Mostly they are borrowed from other languages. Somewhere one joke is created and others use the same one universally. I mean, that applies to more than 90% of the jokes. Now, if it is related to a language-related pun, then of course they will be limited to the area in which that language is spoken. And sometimes they are, они связаны с реалиями той местности, тогда это местные. Но надо расширять свои знания и надеяться, что мы будем знать, о чем идет речь. Что я еще могу сказать? У вас свой опыт, у меня опыта пока такого нет. Да, я уже все сказал.
Then we have Ashish. Ashish. Ashish is one of our students here. Yes, Ashish.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Ashish.
Yes, Ashish.
This is our scholar, Ashish. Yes, Ashish.
It was nice listening to you, sir. After 5 years, we had wonderful classes for MPhil and PhD on various translation and interpretation subjects. So lately, I was in an interpretation assignment, and I was in a situation, just wanted to share with you and wanted to have some comments from you on what had happened. So I was interpreting for a delegation, like very high dignitaries. So one of our very senior officers, what he did was he takes out his mobile and he, in a certain situation, he starts reading out 8 to 9 lines of poetry of Bulle Shah. So that's a very typical situation which happened. So from my understanding of what the poetry was, I tried to interpret, like giving a gist and of what he meant to for the like the audience to understand. So I gave that meaning. So how would you react to such a situation, maybe?
Well, firstly, I would ask if you are not conversant with the language, because Bulle Shah is, although, yeah, Bulle Shah is Punjabi. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you are not, even I may not know one of the
Yeah.
words, not to talk of you, because it was in the 17th century. So, uh, so not to talk of a person who is not a Punjabi speaking person. So first thing I would ask is to ask that person to now convey the gist in Hindi or English, whatever, and then convey that. I would do that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's exactly what happened.
Did that happen?
Yeah, yeah. I said that like this is Bulle Shah from 1680s, like 17th century poet. So that would be a bit difficult for me to understand. So me sometimes listening to Coke Studio and then understanding through subtitles gave me a hang of uh, the poetry was. But again the speaker he explained in English, and then I translated that into Russian.
So you found the solution. You always have to, you see, as I said, the interpreter should never be scared, of what the other person will say. No, no, you go according to the situation, and if you handle it, of course, you have to handle it tactfully, which sometimes is missing in my case. Like, let me tell you a situation. I think I already mentioned it in class sometime. Uh, a Kazakh guy, a very senior official of Kazakhstan, in consecutive interpretation, said something, started off the speech, and said, "Пожалуйста, переведите." He had not completed. So what I told him, because you give the environment of what is being said only with the main thing. So I said, no, we еще ничего не сказали. So he was really taken aback, and the whole audience laughed, because actually what he had said was, only preliminary words which cannot be interpreted on their own. So, so that was tactless of me, but it conveyed the meaning, and then he continued, and then I interpreted. So sometimes, yeah, even at the cost of being tactless, which depends on the basic nature of an individual, uh, you have to be not scared and convey, which you did. So there are no issues. You resolve the issue. Fine.
Which brings me to a point, sir. Sometimes it happens that we in India stay in a multilingual setup, and we might have speakers sometimes from maybe Bengal or Assam or Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, Maharashtra, who in who the speaker might in some typical situation might start speaking in, to share some emotion in his or her native language. So we as interpreters should actually ask them what the speaker wants to actually want the audience to understand, and then interpret it.
This, yeah, this happens also.
Yes, sir.
It happened to me in Germany. A guy who was supposed to speak in Hindi was actually speaking in Marathi. Now, till the time I could make out, I interpreted that. And I gestured to him, because I could see him from my booth, to say it in Hindi. And in fact, I sent my colleague to him. Yeah. And she went and told him, "Okay, Hindi boliye." So, so that is how it was resolved. And it happened in another conference to me, uh, that a Czech was speaking in Russian, but he used some Czech expressions. I never minded, because I understood what he was saying, and I did it. Uh, because, I mean, one is basically, either, I don't remember the exact expression now, but either the words were similar or I knew them, because I know some Czech, some Pole. I know for linguistic purposes I learned them. So I did it without stopping at all, into Russian, sorry, into English. And then later the Russians walked up to me and said, мы перестали слушать, потому что он заговорил по-чешски, а вы продолжали переводить и справились. Ну, вот бывает и такое. Так что, yeah, sometimes you may be able to understand because we also understand some Bengali words or some other this. If it's something simple, you may be able to understand.
Right, right, sir.
Otherwise, you have to give it a miss. It's not as if everything is always interpreted 100%. That also we have to keep in mind that in simultaneous, no, there are situations when somebody says something, you may not hear what the person said, or it may be something that you did not understand, or for some other reason, for lack of time, you may miss some of the things. That is a part of interpretation. There is nothing very abnormal about it.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good question.
Thank you, sir. Now we have one of our bright scholars, Amit Mola, who is there in US as a specialist in the interpretation field. He has some question.
Hello. Yeah, before Amit speaks,
Yes.
I in fact wanted to add this in the end that, relating to Mita's question, because she asked about how to teach, and Professor Kumar's remark that at least 2 semesters are required. I wanted to share with the entire audience that our student Amit Jakhmola has been sent by MEA to the Middlesbury Institute of International Studies and is studying translation interpretation there for the second year. And we do interpretation executive as well as simultaneous at a very, very low level because of several constraints. One, the basic constraint is that instead of being an exercise in teaching interpretation, we are also teaching them Russian at a higher level because of lack of knowledge and exposing them to different subjects in Russian and in English, different areas. Now, since Amit is doing it there and we have been communicating, he has told me about some of the methods they use to create an expert out of you. So, of course, some of those things I have been aware of, but I would say that Amit is a much better person to tell us about the techniques that could be used for furthering one's knowledge at a personal level, because as regards having a separate school, yes, in the last year of my work at JNU, a group was formed from 5 languages to try and look into the possibility of creating a separate interpretation department where the general things would be taught, and for every language there would be but that came to nothing ultimately because the ministerial support, I suppose, or maybe lack of initiative, because I left in June, so that was already holiday time, but it petered out thereafter, most probably because of lack of support from the government. And without their support, it cannot be done in India. It cannot be done as an initiative of individuals. Yeah, so, but for raising one's personal level, yes, Amit Jakhmola, our student, would be a much better source, and I would suggest that maybe he would be asked to speak if there is time today itself, or maybe some other time, to share the techniques being employed there for raising different types of linguistic and interpretation competence. Thank you. Yeah, now, Amit, sorry for interrupting. Now you may speak.
Yeah, just before like Amit
Hello,
says,
sir.
sorry
This is
Amit,
Amit.
just we have already
Okay.
discussed
Okay, sir.
with Amit that we have will be having another session of on the same area, in which we have already requested Amit to be one of our speakers.
Well, so that's very good.
Yeah,
So I'm
yeah,
happy.
Amit, please.
Yeah, sir. My question is about how do you render proper names, especially Chinese and Japanese name, while doing simultaneous interpretation? I know that there is a proper system of Russian English transcription where you can see how do you like the correct pronunciation for Chinese name. For example, the most common Shinzo Abe or Xi Jinping. These are the names, and but these are very common names, so everybody know how to pronounce them in Russian. But what about other names? For example, name of some writer. So how do you render these names, like the Chinese, German? Because there is a proper system, and it is possible to do it while translation, but during simultaneous interpretation, how would you do that?
I absolutely appreciate. Like Wuhan in Chinese would be Wuhan. Yeah, Wuhan.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Now, obviously, it's not a simple thing. So, if you don't know, you will have to do it the way you can. There is no choice. I mean, so, if you are reading a lot of Russian, yeah, and you come across such names and you make the effort to equate with them with the original and the English version, then only you will have complete success. Otherwise, it will always be partial. Yeah. So you are right. I mean, I have not really come across such an issue. I mean, we get to interpret very rarely. You see, unlike, let's say, a person like you who will be, plunging into it full time once you get the chance. We get to interpret very rarely, and I personally have not come across problem. But yes, you are absolutely right that this is a complex issue, and people dealing with that area, let's say, who has to deal with China, you know, would have to make the effort to equate, yeah, and learn the whole table and learn the names and the etc. They will have to do that. That's all I can tell you. Maybe you can say something better on this. Maybe you have learned something. Is that so?
Yeah, sir. We have been told to go through that transcription table and try to, yeah, that is the only option, sir.
Yes, and of course read more. Let's say you read something of Chinese in Russian, then you match it with the table. So then you get a hang of the overall table. Yeah. So I think you
Yes, sir.
know the solution better than me. Right. Thank you for the question. Anyway, happy to
Thank
see
you, sir.
you. So no brothers around, I see. Yeah.
Sorry, sir.
कोई नाई वाई नहीं मिल रहे हैं आजकल.
Sir, everything is actually closed. So, like barber shop and everything. So,
तो अपने नेबर से करवाना चाहिए एक दूसरे का.
yeah, that is a good option, sir.
No, no. So that's no issue. It's just okay.
Okay.
Anything
Thank you very much, Amit. Thank you, sir, for answering the questions. I think maybe it's time to move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much, sir, for the wonderful talk you have given. Of course, we always know that you not only give your talks, but you also cherish the students with your kind of jokes or kind of comic sense and all. You have a good sense of humor. That's why like people like your classes. Of course, we missed the chance, like we could not get the chance to get into your class. But through this one, I'm very much delightful and very much enriched with your talk.
Anyway, you were lucky, Sonu, that you didn't have to go through it. So that's all I can say. But I want to just thank all of you. I think it was wonderful sharing and getting to learn from others, because teaching is basically a learning experience. So today was another chance for me, and since I've been out of it for more than a couple of years, it was a great pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Really interesting.